Hi there, this is John Wilkinson again from History Made Easier, with the first of two presentations that will look at the war on the Western Front in 1918. This one looking at the Ludendorff Offensive, also known as the Spring Offensive. Here is where Germany tried to win the war, but instead reached the point where it could no longer do so, but tried desperately not to lose it. You'll see what I mean by that. Too many men had been lost, too much equipment, and American forces were beginning to flood into France. So take a note of all of that, but also note how tactical lessons have been learned by both sides. Ludendorff first attacked on the Somme. There was no strategic advantage to be had. He attacked his stronger enemy at its weakest point, believing that if successful, French morale would collapse. The Germans made use of what they had learned on both the Eastern and Western fronts. They began on March the 9th, bombarding along much of the Western Front so as to disguise where they intended to attack, using mustard gas, phosgene and tear gas too. There was no preliminary bombardment, and troops were brought up to the lines secretly at night. Ludendorff had turned a third of his cavalry into foot soldiers and had trained special storm battalions to advance quickly and find the weakest points in the enemy's line before sending in the mass of his troops. The attack itself began with a hurricane bombardment, with more of the same gases, targeting headquarters and artillery units, as well as the frontline trenches, with more than 6,500 big guns, as well as more than 3,500 heavy trench mortars. The last of the big bombardments of the war, bigger than the Somme and Passchendaele. German air reconnaissance had done their job in mapping the targets. The Germans used artillery, aerial bombardment and strafing, their first troops attacking halfway through the opening barrage, using lightweight submachine guns. But if the Germans had learned from 3 years of Entente offensives, though not enough to not bother, the British had applied the German defence-in-depth strategy. A forward zone with barbed wire and machine gun posts to cover the gaps between strong points. Behind this was the battle zone with strong redoubts, and then much further back was the rear zone, though this had few defences. The Germans were lucky, as when they attacked on March the 21st, there was heavy fog, which enabled the Germans to get past the British machine gun posts, the most critical line in their defence, as it had been throughout the war. The British were pushed back more than 60 kilometres and were close to collapse. This was now a return to open warfare and a war of movement, and the British troops enlisted since the start of the war had no experience of it, whilst the French were wary to lend their support lest they leave Paris vulnerable. But the Germans had their own problems: mounting losses, stretched communications, and their artillery couldn't keep up with their advance. At a conference on March the 26th, called by Haig and meeting in Doullens on the Somme, Haig argued that if French support wasn't provided, the British and French armies would be separated, with the danger being that the British would fall back to the Channel ports and the French would fall back to Paris, in which case the war would be lost. Clemenceau backed him, and it was agreed that the French would support the British lines at Amiens, but Haig was obliged to agree to Foch taking overall command of the Entente forces. So, after almost 4 years of war, overall command of the Entente forces was in the hands of one man, the French Chief of Staff, Marshal Foch. On March the 28th, the Germans attacked at Arras, but met firm resistance before Amiens became their focus on April the 4th, becoming the key to the whole offensive. The Entente forces using railways were able to get reserves in position faster than the Germans, who were advancing on foot, and as always, advancing beyond the range of artillery cover. The result being Ludendorff soon called off this offensive. It was the loss of men and artillery pieces, tanks and aircraft that weighed most on the Entente powers, but the Germans had lost just as many men, the estimate being a little over 250,000 men each. And Amiens was held. The British and French armies had not been split, but the Germans now had a deep salient to defend, the very territory they had withdrawn from in 1917 in order to build a more solid defensive line, the Hindenburg Line. The Germans, however, were not finished. They had a second phase planned at Ypres, and on April the 9th the Germans committed just about everything to this second assault, and the Allies committed the same to repelling it. They had to. Behind Ypres was a vital railway junction, and behind that the ports of Dunkirk and Calais. Then, on April the 24th, the Germans, with no breakthrough at Ypres, returned to the Somme, targeting the British lines at Amiens again. The British transferred men from Italy and Palestine. They also brought in 100,000 raw recruits from Britain, many of them only 18 or 19 years old. Britain also extended conscription to Ireland, something it had been very reluctant to do so for political reasons. And between the French and the British, 60,000 wounded men were being returned to the battlefields each month, while some Americans had also been thrown into the fray. It was that desperate. But again, the Germans were stopped. It had now taken on the feel of a decisive moment having been reached. The British and French rightly thought that the Germans were not finished, but feared that they themselves might be close to being so. At a meeting of the Supreme War Council, presided over by Clemenceau on May the 1st and May the 2nd, a bitter exchange took place, as Pershing, in charge of the American forces, refused to bring any further American troops into the British and French lines. He insisted on waiting until America had enough troops to create its own army. Instead, he offered a compromise. Those Americans arriving in May and June, and that would be 280,000 men, would be made available to enter the line, but all troops arriving after June would be held back. The British and French had to accept, but they did so with considerable resentment. On May the 27th, Ludendorff tried again, this time on the River Aisne, near Soissons. The original purpose of the attack was to suck in Entente reserves and so weaken the British lines in Flanders, which he planned to attack in June. But such was the German success, and perhaps Ludendorff's desperation, that Paris again became the target. So, another attack began on June the 8th, with mustard gas and phosgene again thrown in to the initial bombardment. As had become the norm, everything was thrown into the battle. Infantry, cavalry, tanks and planes. The British, French and Americans regrouped. Once more, the French appealed desperately to Pershing, but still he wouldn't release more men. He informed them that America wouldn't be ready to make a significant contribution until the end of the year. The British and French were stunned. But there was the agreement of May the 2nd that the 280,000 Americans arriving in May and June could be used, and these helped to hold the German advance, before launching a counterattack on June the 11th, attacking without a preliminary barrage, so taking the Germans by surprise, and using instead a creeping barrage with tanks and strafing aircraft in support. On June the 12th, Ludendorff brought things to a halt. Yet the Germans attacked again. This was the Second Battle of the Marne. It was launched at midnight on July the 14th, 15th, but the French had learnt of the attack, including its timing, and had all but cleared its forward trenches, so escaping the German bombardment, whilst they opened a barrage of their own, targeting the German guns and their men as they moved up ready to attack. Still, it was another desperate fight, but the line was held before the Germans were hit hard with another counterattack. The Germans were forced back over the River Marne and out of Soissons. This was the battle, by the way, in which Hitler received the Iron Cross First Class. Though the Germans would fight on into August, the Second Battle of the Marne was over. Ludendorff's gamble had failed. He described it as the first great setback for Germany, clearly forgetting the First Battle of the Marne, or Verdun. The Kaiser understood its significance, describing himself as a defeated warlord. And that's the Ludendorff Offensive, or the Spring Offensive. Germany didn't achieve a decisive victory, and though the war was not yet won by the Entente powers and their allies, Germany could no longer win it. It had been back to the open warfare of 1914, but with superior tactics, if still with the same massive loss of life, and for Germany, the lack of a breakthrough. As always, I hope it has been useful for you. I would again say that I have a lot more detail in my notes, and you should know the drill by now if you want to get your hands on those notes. But for now, let me thank you for listening and wish you the very best of luck with your studies. Cheers.